Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science of Science Communication, What Marketers Need to Know. I am Shane Hanlon. I am Executive Editor at BrandLab here at ACS. And joining me today is my colleague, Jordan Nutting. And we're really excited to be, I was going to say, talking with you, talking to you, talking to all of you about the Science of Science Communication. So briefly, this is the BrandLab team. You see myself and Jordan there. Our colleague Heather is also on the line. She's going to be taking your questions and join us at the end to go over some Q&A. We also have a brand new colleague, literally started on Monday, Sarah Ashley Jolly, who is not on this slide, but I wanted to recognize her as well. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with BrandLab, what would you say we do here? So we are a creative content studio at ACS. Our whole goal is helping scientists, science organizations, just helping folks communicate and tell their story in really engaging and compelling ways. And so we do this through a number of different campaigns and products, some of which you can see here. But at the end of the day, our goal is to really help folks tell their story in a way that will resonate with their audience. So that is kind of the very brief about us. The big question here today, I think, is what exactly is science communication? And maybe this seems very obvious. Maybe it's thinking, oh, it's science and communication, of course. But kind of how are we defining that? And thing one, because we are communicators, I want to say that science communication henceforth is going to be referred to as SciComm. That is the vernacular in the field. So we're going to go with that. And so SciComm, at the end of the day, is marketing science. And I will tell you, me personally, I am a PhD scientist by training, very much an applied scientist in biology, and I bristled against this for years, this idea that marketing had any role in science communication. And I have come full circle on that because SciComm is marketing science. And when we think about marketing, there are a number of different ways we think about that, right? You're going to see a lot of examples from BrandLab, from ACS, from us personally, because that's what we know and that's what we have rights to, frankly. But there are a number of different ways you could do kind of what I will refer to as traditional marketing or just marketing full stop. So there are emails, presence on LinkedIn. The top right is a grab from a carousel we have on one of our websites. And these are all digital offerings. We also do a lot of this in person. Many of us, not just us at ACS, go to events or conferences or some other live offerings. And so marketing is just getting the word out about initiatives and different things going on, maybe at your company or at your organization. And like I mentioned, SciComm is marketing science. It's getting the word out there about why science might be valuable to you, why a specific offering might be engaging, why you might want to interact with it. And this could happen through different types of science communication pieces, in-person events. We in BrandLab create these email series or websites. So SciComm is really just marketing science versus marketing maybe a product or an initiative or something like that. But it kind of begs the question, why do these two things go together, or why even frame it this way? Like marketing, yes, marketing, science communication is marketing science, but I feel like folks, myself included for a very long time, bristle when you put marketing and SciComm in the same sentence. So really, why think about it through this marketing lens? I mentioned I'm a PhD biologist. I studied frogs and turtles and reptiles. That's what my thesis was about. I don't do that these days, but I still have an interest in it. And so picture me, someone talking to me about this really interesting thing that happens in biology. And yes, me, I am that target audience, right? That is exactly for me. But for many folks, majority of folks, I don't know, but that might not be exactly something they're interested in. Providing someone information might not be enough for them to maybe not only understand it, but especially to engage with it or be excited by it. And this is something we like to refer to as the deficit model of communication. This idea that folks just need that education. They need the knowledge. They are in a deficit of information. And so just if you give them that information, they'll be excited about it. They'll want to engage with it. They'll want to be in conversation with you. And what we know from the science of science communication is that the deficit model, it doesn't work. It really doesn't. It is not enough to simply tell people something, to give them the information, to even educate them. Information itself is not enough. There needs to be more. Communication in many ways is about connection. It's about establishing relationships with folks. And this is independent of science communication. Communication in general. Think about some of the most engaging conversations you have. Think about frankly, some of the deepest arguments you might have had. There was a connection there that was beyond just passing information back and forth. There is a difference between deficit communication and actually engaging with folks. And we do this every day in our lives, again, independent of science or marketing or any of that. Any conversation we have that is meaningful, there is some sort of connection there. But then we need to transfer what we know from communication, from the science behind communication, to communicating about science, to marketing, establishing these connections. And there's a ton of science out there about this. And I think part of, and I will speak for Jordan on this, one of the fun things about this specific thing we're doing right now was really digging into the science behind communication, being able to showcase a lot of the really great work out there. And we know that something like, again, providing folks more information does not necessarily bring them to a common conclusion. If anything, there are work out there that shows that folks who are more entrenched in their belief system, as they get more information, they will use the fact that they have more information to further entrench into that belief system. There's this example on the left. I'm not going to dig into too deeply because Jordan is really going to dig into this one. But on the right, there's this really interesting study about renewable energy and specifically how folks feel about renewable energy based on their political affiliation, but also their level of education. And you can see, you don't even need to know what the x-axis or the y-axis or what any of these labels are. You can literally see the divergence here. So even without any context, as you go from left to right, from less education to more education, folks become more divergent in their belief system. And so again, it's not enough just to give folks the information. There needs to be persuasion behind it. There needs to be connection. There needs to be actual relationship building. And so we're hoping that over the course of the next 30 some minutes, maybe, we're not gonna be able to go over everything, but hopefully provide some science behind science communication and how this can relate to us all in the marketing world to hopefully, at the very least, impart some knowledge, at the very most, provide some really good examples as to how SciComm can inform marketing. And so now I'll hand things over to Jordan to really kind of dig into this.
All right, thanks, Shane. Hi, everybody. So to round out the presentation today, we're going to be digging into three aspects of what science communication research has to say about communication and reaching our audiences, engaging them effectively. So we're going to kick it off with audience, then we'll move into the importance of how we message to that audience and what that message includes and how we frame it. And then we'll finish up with talking about the modes and mediums by which we end up communicating. So I'm sure everybody attending this call, if you are working in marketing, if you're working in science communication, wherever you are, I think we can all acknowledge the fact that knowing who our audience is essential to effectively communicating. As marketers on the call, you get this. That's why we spend time, we spend money actually developing personas, doing customer interviews, running audience surveys. It's important to know who we're trying to reach with our messages. And it's not just about knowing maybe what they do, where they're from, what maybe challenges they have at work, but it's often getting a little bit deeper about what do members of our audience value, what frustrates them, what makes them laugh, what do they enjoy, what makes their work or lives more satisfying. These are all things that we want to know about our audiences as we're crafting communications for them. And again, with this analogy that we're talking about between SciComm and scientific marketing, it's the same for science communicators. Science communicators can reach hugely different audiences depending on what their goals and purposes are. You can go from trying to work with children and doing early education outreach, all the way up to talking about and marketing science in halls of government. And similarly, many science communicators use the same tools as marketers to understand audiences, such as personas and surveys, interviews, and research. But with all of that, there is this challenge that all of us who need to know who our audiences are, there's a challenge of actually being able to accurately describe that audience. That's why we do all that work. And I wanted to start this by sharing some recent research that just shows how challenging it can be to really define our audience, and puts that challenge to all of us to really make sure that we understand who we're trying to reach with our communications. So in this publication from McCarthy and Grant, they analyzed a body of science communication literature to see how and if the people writing in this field are actually defining what they mean by audience in their research. They begin the study with this challenge, this idea that maybe when we talk about audience, it's not always as clear as we might think. We might just say, here is our audience, and this is the audience we're trying to reach. And then the details about that audience are implied and ambiguous, rather than having a really clear idea of who they're trying to reach. And as it turns out, of the science communication papers that talk about audience that they analyzed, only 4% of those papers actually gave explicit descriptions of audience. And I think that this finding is a challenge to all of us, whether we're in marketing or science communication, to be as clear as we can be about audience, and maybe even honest about what we don't know about our audiences. I encourage all of you to take a look at the article. We have pulled in PDF copies of all the research that we're highlighting today as a resource for you all, so you should be able to take a look. But in addition to, I think, this rather startling finding, is they also provide various descriptors of how we might define audience. And it goes beyond, again, job title, demographics, but it also looks at the plurality of an audience, the plurality of their beliefs and their identities, looks at their value systems, all these different ways that we can think about how we more clearly define who our audiences are and understand who they are, so that we can best tailor our communications to them. And really, for me, reading that, the key takeaway is this idea that if we can clearly define who our audience is, it's a very challenging task, but it's something we need to do. And we need to use the data and resources that are at our disposal to try to understand who our audiences are, so that we can avoid maybe stereotypes or assumptions. This is work that we do at the C&EN BrandLab team a lot. Last year, we put out a survey to our audience, which we would define maybe ambiguously based on the past research study as people working in the chemical sciences and people adjacent to the field of chemistry. And we presented those results earlier this year, but this is all this ongoing effort to understand who makes up our audience, what makes them tick, how can we best reach them, what are they interested in. Now with that, I'm talking a little bit about making sure that we're not making assumptions about our audiences. So I want to talk about a big assumption that for those of us who are working in science marketing, we're often charged with reaching scientific audiences, people who are trained in science. So I want to address a misconception or an assumption that many of us might make about our target audiences there. So one assumption that you might make about reaching scientists is that they're highly educated, they're scientifically literate. Probably all you need to convince them, engage them, get them to see your point of view is to present them with facts and rigorous arguments to convince them of of your message and what you're trying to communicate. This idea that scientists are purely logical people, that they're factual, that they just need the science to make decisions, and that's it. And as Shane alluded to earlier, that's not necessarily the case. In reality, it turns out that scientists, people that are highly educated and scientifically literate, can be really good at justifying their beliefs, even if they may or may not be wrong. So I want to dig into that paper Shane referenced, so from Drummond and Fishoff from 2017. What they did was they looked at survey data that included questions about beliefs, about controversial science topics, and then also measured people's level of education, or specifically their science education and their science literacy. And they looked at how people's, based on these surveys, how their beliefs about these topics tracked with their scientific literacy. Now, you might expect that as people become, more in tune with the science, more in tune with the information, that their beliefs about certain topics become tighter. There's more consensus that grows. Whereas you might start off with maybe, so you start off with a high school education, you might have widely disparate beliefs, but then by the time you're, graduate students, you have a post-grad education, like you understand the science, like you can come to this shared understanding at that point. But in reality, what they found for a number of the topics that showed up in these surveys was that as people's education and knowledge of the science grew, they became more polarized about certain topics. Now, these topics do include things like climate change, evolution, stem cell research, Big Bang, certainly things that are controversial, but just go to show this idea that just because somebody knows science, somebody is highly educated, might their work relies on a great deal of logic, people with the same background can arrive at very different conclusions. And in this study, what they found was the main drivers of these differences came down to the respondents' politics and their religious backgrounds. And so with this, what we can understand is that scientists, our audience, if we're science marketers, they're not a monolith. They're not just this, group of people that are highly factual, highly logical. There's going to be other values and belief systems and backgrounds and parts of their identity that inform their beliefs about science or the decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. I think scientists aren't just about consuming facts. They aren't just about filling a knowledge deficit, as Shane said. They make emotionally involved belief-driven decisions too. So with that, if as communicators, we can't solely rely on facts to, convince our audience or drive them towards a specific action, what does that mean for how we actually frame and structure the messages we're communicating? So I'm going to transition now into the section about messaging. And I love this line from poet Emily Dickinson, "To all the truth, but tell it slant." I think it fits very nicely into what we'll be talking about throughout this section. So I want to start with presenting you all with some survey information that's run every year out of Yale regarding Americans' opinions about climate change and global warming. We don't have a formal poll set up, but I'm going to ask this question and I want you all just to hold your best guess in your head. So last year in 2024, what percentage of surveyed Americans agreed that, quote, global warming is happening? Give you a beat, think of a number. Okay. So as it turns out, based on this survey, about 3/4 of Americans would agree with the statement that global warming is happening. When I first encountered this information, I found it surprising. I'm curious about whether or not others found the same. But yeah, apparently a majority of Americans would agree that global warming is happening. they can agree with this statement as a matter of fact. But then the survey goes into asking more questions about the impact of global warming. And I want to have us all look at what happens then. So we ask the question then, who will global warming actually harm? And to what extent will it harm those groups? So this first one looks at statements, global warming will harm future generations. And a very similar proportion of respondents say that, yeah, global warming will harm future generations of people to a greater moderate amount. It's a very similar breakdown as the number of people who say global warming is happening. Now, future generations is a very abstract, sort of far away entity. We don't really necessarily have a good picture in our head of what that means. And so this next series of questions starts to get at who global warming will impact, getting a little bit more concrete as we go on. So in developing countries, a smaller proportion, but very similar, say that, yeah, global warming will harm people in some other country, some other place that I can maybe picture in my head, but not here, not in the US. So then let's ask, what happens with global warming and people in the US? We start to see this downward shift that it might not affect us to the same extent. But then what's really fascinating is then we get down to the question of global warming will harm me personally. And now we've gone to a 50-50 split in responses. So we start off with majority of people, 3/4 of survey respondents saying global warming's happening. But then we get down to basically an even split, minority of people even saying it's probably not going to harm me personally. This isn't a big issue for me. There is a disconnect between a fact people may believe and how they actually internalize and personalize that fact. And so I think this really reflects the mission we all have as communicators, as how do we bridge the gap between factual information and making that more personable, something that people can act upon, or something that can help people change their minds, reconsider the stance they may have once had. And so what communication science tells us is that one of the more effective ways to bridge the factual and the personal is through the use of storytelling. So over the past few decades, storytelling as a tool in communications has really risen to prominence. I'm sure a lot of people in the call today have heard about the role of storytelling, whether or not it's in science communication or if it's in scientific marketing. And there's a good reason for that. Storytelling can be a very powerful way of sharing information and getting it to stick with your audience and getting it to, if not take action, even just to reconsider maybe some previous stance they had, or to take in new knowledge and maybe understand it a little bit more completely. So I won't go into all the specific studies that show that why storytelling is effective. This review from Cormac here has a nice collection of that information. But overall, how story can help us get across challenging information is that it can make it more likely that people remember what they encounter in that story, more so than maybe even having prior knowledge or being presented with a more factual outline of information. It can reduce counter-arguing. Very important if you're communicating about something where maybe the topic itself is complex and controversial, or maybe you're asking them to change a behavior that they've had, or as a science marketer, change the type of product and the provider that they're going with, and you want to address some of their concerns and push back against that idea. Storytelling can make people feel that the situation that's described over the course of the story is their own. They can get transported into that story. They can see themselves within it, and that can, again, help lower some of those cognitive barriers to the information. And then this all comes together to help the information you provide within the story be more convincing than the data presented on its own. So with all that, and with all of us, I think, having encountered some idea of the idea that storytelling is a really powerful communication tool, it leaves us with a question of what actually is a story, what is storytelling, and then what makes a story good. We encounter those questions a lot with our work in BrandLab. So what is a story? Let's start there. There are a lot of definitions out there. There's also a lot of lack of definitions out there for what story is. We can kind of say, oh, this is storytelling, and we paint whatever communication we have as a story and call it good. But at its core, story and storytelling is a structured way of communicating information. And I will say the specific structure that communication takes is not what makes something a story. I think this is illustrated nicely with these doodles from author Kurt Vonnegut, where you have 3 different stories or story archetypes, and they all mapping out main characters' good or ill fortune. They all look very different in how that progresses. Personally, my favorite one here is on the right for Hamlet. Main character Hamlet, nothing really changes to his fortune over the course of the story. But for any of us who have read the play or seen the play, we know that there's a compelling story in there, even if maybe his fortunes haven't drastically changed over the course of the story itself. So story is structure, and it's a way of communicating information. But what that structure needs to be a story are a few key elements. We need characters. We need those characters to interact with a plot. That plot and those characters need to be within a setting. And there's often some sort of purpose or moral behind what's being communicated in the story. And those are really like the key elements of what pulls us together a story. And because we can use that sort of definition, it turns out that stories and storytelling structures don't only have to exist within fiction. They can exist in all sorts of different modes of communication. And these have actually been mapped out in various ways. So on the left here, we have an example of a scientific presentation that shows how you can have this arc of a story and its elements of a story that play out through this progression from lack of knowledge to having more knowledge. You have scene setting for why research is important, and character being challenged with not knowing something about a particular topic, and then finally resolving with, this is what we learned and this is what we can do with it. That ties into a narrative and storytelling structure. And then similarly, there have been communications researchers who have even been able to find narrative elements, storytelling elements within things like Supreme Court decisions, things like plot progression, cognitive tension, staging. Those are all there. So storytelling can show up in a lot of different places and can be put to use in a lot of different modes of communication. But with that, I think a lot of us can agree that not all stories that we hear or read about or watch are necessarily good or effective ones, especially given maybe some of the goals we might have as marketers or science communicators. A Supreme Court decision might have storytelling elements in it, but I imagine for a lot of people, it's not necessarily the most engaging reading, barring the people for who it is. But so then, what actually makes a story stick, and what makes it good? What makes people want to engage with it? What makes a story actually elicit change in a person who's encountering it? So these 4 recommendations come out of a gathering of scholars who specialize in storytelling and were synthesized by journalism researchers at the University of Florida. And these are specifically for what makes an effective story when you're communicating about a complex topic. So topics that have a lot of moving parts, a lot of different issues to weigh, that might require systemic changes to affect change or to change the situation that's presented within the story. Very much the sort of situation we might find when we're talking about science, whether it's a science communicator or science marketer, with complex messages to get across. So within our stories, if we want them to be effective, we want to consider, how can we tell stories about people, actually involving real characters, real individuals with real challenges and real lives. Okay, that's one. We also want to create visuals. And this isn't about, putting in a photograph or a video within your communication, although that's can be part of it. You can also use language to create visuals to really it taps into this idea with storytelling of transporting your audience into a setting in your place, to help them feel that, again, that's the story is their own. You create that space for them and you bring them in. We also want to think about ways to use stories that um, that can frame the issue, the message, in a way that aligns with our audience's worldview. And with that it means you figure out, okay, here's the audience that I'm trying to communicate to. Here are the things they value. And then how do I talk about this issue in a way that speaks to that value? Maybe my audience members really care about the protection of like personal property. This is coming out of like climate change communications. My audience really cares about their land management and making sure that it's safe and protected for their children. Then you can structure your story around climate change, speaking to that particular issue and talking about how climate change can threaten some of those, uh, maybe threaten the protection of your land for whatever ways. There's a lot of ways to think about how to frame the message in accordance with your audience's worldviews and beliefs and values. And then finally, giving enough space to make connections. I think this is one that can be hard as marketers. We want to go in and tell somebody, okay, you have this information, now here's my call to action, and you're going to go do it, and make it really clear what the next step is supposed to be. There can be a lot of power in stories that allow your audience to take in the information and then figure out, this is what I'm supposed to do with it. And you need to use that judiciously, but it can be a really powerful way to form those connections in their brain and help them feel that agency in actually making a decision with the information that they've received. So I want to bring up an example from a ebook that we produced here at BrandLab. The ebook showcased various products made from soybeans as a feedstock. And this particular quote comes from a researcher at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who has a lot of experience developing soy-based inks. And in the quote, she says, "A company said they wanted to do baby foot printing with soy ink. At first, I thought they were making fun of me because everyone knew I was pregnant. I quickly developed the ink, and my daughter turned out to be the first baby in the U.S. to be footprinted with soy ink." Okay, very short little story, a little quote there, but it actually pulls into a few of those storytelling elements that I mentioned on the last slide. So we have a real person. We have them, they're showing emotion. They're showing some personal details. There's this element of surprise. There's a real person talking here, the real personality. But then also, the audience is left to make a connection. This ink, it's not just that she's made an ink, but this ink is obviously really safe. It's something that this researcher would trust to have printed onto her own child's foot and used in foot printing. Now, this quote doesn't come in and say, soy ink is safe. You don't need to necessarily say that. The audience can make that connection. And I think that ends up leaving a stronger impact in the mind of the reader rather than, hitting them over the head with your message. This stuff is safe. You can use it. Great. Okay. So before we finish up about messaging and storytelling, I do want to address one question or issue that I know I've encountered. So there's this question of whether or not stories are unethical when we're talking about science and facts and when we're communicating. Especially in the scientific community, I've seen storytelling get a bad rap. And I also have encountered this with people who are now marketers at science organizations who originally trained as scientists. There's a quote here from a letter to the editor style communication saying that storytelling is all about embellishing and concealing information, that inconvenient truths are swept away, they're hidden. And this really, when you have this perspective of storytelling, it feels very antithetical to science, and how we communicate science. But as someone who, like Shane, was trained up in science, and I've written my fair share of peer-reviewed research articles, this perspective, I think, is incomplete, and it shows an incomplete idea of what storytelling is and can be when we're talking about science. And this is why I pulled up that line from Emily Dickinson: "You tell all the truth, but tell it slant." As communicators of science and in general, it's on us to say what is true, and we say it in a way that honors our audience. So whether or not the scientists that you're trying to reach or that you're working with in your own communication strategies, people within science use storytelling elements and structures with communicating with each other. It's not just something that we can pull out for a general lay public. Scientists and all people care about the form of information as much as the information itself. So again, with messaging, tell the truth, give your audience the details it needs to make decisions, to be able to consider the options before them, but really take care to consider the package that your message comes in, and what elements might be effective for reaching your audience. And then, again, as encouragement to everybody on the call, stories are all throughout science. You might have to do a little bit of digging, but they are there. And when you find them, they're really, it's really exciting to be able to pull them out and share them with the rest of the world. Scientists are constantly on this course of discovery, encountering new information, overcoming challenges, and it's all happening within broader contexts of environmental issues, broader policy decisions, other emerging technologies. There's a lot that we can pull in as marketers and communicators to identify stories and pull them out. It's what we love doing at BrandLab, and I would just leave that as an encouragement to everybody on the call today. Keep your eye open for those stories and those opportunities to make science personal. And with that, we're moving on to the last segment, where we're talking more about mode and mediums of communication.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to end the last handful of minutes here, at least from our presenting perspective, with, okay, so here is what SciComm is, and then here is how we use it to communicate and how it can apply to marketing. But really getting into the end here, what are some examples of how we do that, right? Well, how do we actually put this theory and this research into practice? And so just to kind of go back to the beginning when we started here, there are sorts of different modes of SciComm and all sorts of different ways that we market things. You can, if you're remembering, the first time I presented this was a marketing slide, and now it's a SciComm slide. And that is by design, because communication and marketing go hand in hand. If you take nothing else from this, which I hope you do, that is one of the biggest kind of take homes here. And so there are all sorts of different modes of communication out there, many of which are virtual or digital, but not all of them. And so I just want to kind of dig into a few here as we go through this. From a marketing perspective, email marketing is huge. We do a ton of it at ACS. We do it specifically for BrandLab materials. And we do it because it works. Because if it didn't work, we wouldn't do it. A lot about, we talk about the science behind science communication. There's a science behind marketing. There is research. There's literally market research, right? And so we do the research to understand what works and what doesn't. And email communication works, but we get so many emails these days, myself included. And so how do we get email to stand out? How do we use the principles of science communication, this idea of knowing your audience and telling a story and getting some sort of a narrative across in an engaging and compelling way? How do we apply that to email? And one example that we found that isn't for everyone and requires a little bit more engagement. That's the point. Are these ideas of these email series. And so our colleagues at C&EN on the journal side, or excuse me, on the news publication side, but also us in BrandLab have been doing these email series around a topic or a theme. And a lot of them have been geared more towards scientists to early career researchers, those types of audience. But the idea is you sign up for an email series that is around a whole slew of different types of topics or themes, but then you really get to dig into something over the course of X number of weeks. And so we've already kind of checked that engagement part, right? This isn't just passive, hey, you got this email. It's we have found an audience who is interested in what we want to communicate to them. And now over the course of usually 5 to 7 weeks, we are going to engage with them. And we did this from a marketing perspective as well. We had this live event last fall at one of our meetings, and we basically turned a lot of that content into this different format where folks could engage and learn and really hopefully take something away from it. So it's not just, hey, here are things you don't know, going back to that deficit model aspect of it, but it's, hey, here are things you might not know, but also present it in a way that you are literally signing up for this engagement. And running over the course of this was like one of our 6-part series, but yeah, usually between 5 and 7. So it's still email, which many of us are familiar with, but it has that level of engagement and excitement and frankly, accessibility. Social media is huge, right? There are so many different platforms. This is not a conversation around social media. I'm not intending it to be, but I did just want to touch on briefly something that we, especially in the marketing space, talk about and utilize is LinkedIn. We are, from an ACS perspective, from specifically our media group within our marketing and sales arm, very active on LinkedIn. And then some of us on the BrandLab team especially are really active on kind of our personal accounts as well. I would suggest that you find us, but especially our colleague, Jesse, who is a wealth of knowledge and very, very active in the LinkedIn space. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of kind of what I've been using in my own personal LinkedIn, again, drawing from these ideas, these principles of science communication. But really small thing, and you might already, this might be a duh for many of you out there, but I think it might be worth reiterating that doing a kind of a primary post versus the repost almost always is going to get folks at least more impressions, maybe more engagement. And story plays into this as well. Is it you are kind of retelling or trying to yes and a story versus this is the thing, like this is what it means to me. This is why I care about the science communication or the science behind science communication, why I care about the fact that science communication is marketing science. There is a ton of market research out there about how we post and how we utilize LinkedIn, but there is literal science behind SciComm around social media and using things like images or visuals or even figures that could usually get a lot more engagement. And I'm using the word engagement, not literally the way that LinkedIn uses engagement, but just folks interacting or at least viewing what you're putting out there. It doesn't always work, right? It's not a surefire way. There is a wide range of what folks are doing on these platforms. But what's really interesting, especially from a SciComm space, is that even there's been work out there that shows that even grabbing, in this case, I put a lot of primary SciComm research out on LinkedIn, even just doing a screen grab of a manuscript title or an abstract, rather than just kind of a primary, hey, here's a bunch of text. This is literally a picture of text, and folks are more interested in that than just anything that I would write. So it's kind of a multimodal story. It's not just, hey, here's what I have to say about it, but also here's how it potentially complements what I'm trying to talk about. And then those are really digital kind of online options, But I love getting out and talking to folks, whether it's through a virtual medium like this, whether it's literally in person. I am an audio person by design. You can see I have like a studio. I'm in my basement. I have a fancy mic attached to my desk. This is something I'm really passionate about. And I love audio storytelling because if there's a visual component to it, that's great. If they're not, it's really nice way to I feel like it's almost more intimate. You hear folks in your ears, or you hear something in your ears, you almost have to imagine it. And so utilizing talks, whether in a physical space or virtual space, it's literal telling of story. And so I didn't want to dig kind of too deep into all of the here are all these different modes and mediums, but just a handful and just some things that have worked for us and some great lessons learned from the marketing space, but also from what we've learned doing this research into science communication. So I think at the end of the day, something we've definitely learned is this idea of lead with content. Jordan said it earlier, don't hit folks over the head. I say that almost every day in my professional world about when we're talking about content and story and messaging. This idea of like, we want to lead with the content, but not necessarily the product, not necessarily, hey, do this thing, right? Make sure that you're telling a story, and then we can add the brand or add that product in later. It's here's how we hook you. Here's why we care about this. Here's why you should care about it. Oh, by the way, here's the thing. And I think some of the most successful marketing stories have those elements, and some of the most successful science communication have those elements as well. And honestly, there's just not one size fits, there's no one size fits all solution to any of this, but by understanding a lot of these different options, understanding the science behind science communication and how that applies and can apply to marketing, we hope that we've imparted some at the very least something you didn't know before coming to our webinar today. And so we are BrandLab. We are happy that you're all here with us today. You can find us via email, website, LinkedIn. We're at many, many places. We are always happy to engage with y'all. And so speaking of which, in the remaining time we have, we are going to bring in our colleague, Heather, who's been listening along with us this entire time, and we'll be able to ask some questions of us. If you have a question for us, there's that question box where you can ask it. We won't be able to get to everything, but hopefully we can get to some of them. And again, happy to engage after this as well. Hi, Heather.
Hello, Shane and Jordan. As a colleague, I just have to say congratulations and well done. That was very interesting for me to listen to, even though I'm very familiar with the content. So let's dig into some questions. So we do have a fair amount to get through, so I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we will try our best to prioritize some. Others we can follow up with afterwards. So to start us out, one question that I think speaks to both of you, so either one can begin, obviously, but do you think scientists should be trained in communication?
I have so
What if
many
I said no?
Don't do it, Jordan.
No. Yes, wholeheartedly yes. I have the benefit of having come up through with my education, starting at a liberal arts school, where being able to communicate, even if you were on a more technical track with your studies, was incredibly important, and it stuck with me all through my graduate training in science. And it's, even if you as a scientist aren't necessarily going to be going out and giving TED Talks or doing outreach events, even just knowing the principles of communication and effective communication to reach other scientists effectively is going to be so important. And so, yes, scientists should be trained in communication. They should be able, I think they should all be able to answer the question of like, why is what you're doing of importance to anybody on the street? What are the broader impacts? But then also just for their own professional success, and being able to network and engage with colleagues more effectively.
I used to teach scientists how to communicate more effectively as a job, so I have much more of a yes and in that perspective. The one thing I will add though about how it can be good from a marketing perspective, we talk to subject matter experts all the time. We are creating content, and a big part of that content is talking to the literal experts. If the experts have some sort of training in communication beyond talking to their peers, it makes our job easier as content creators. It makes our marketing colleagues' jobs easier. So it's just good full stop from a science communication, from a capital S science, and from a marketing perspective. If we all, frankly, can communicate better, but especially researchers who have very deep technical knowledge and being able to explain that in a way that's more accessible to the folks trying to get the word out there, can only be good.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right. So we have many other questions coming in. I will go ahead and just select one that I feel like also you both can expand on and resonates with the conversation. So one question we have here is, what are some techniques to address the backfire effect when audiences reject science-based messages that conflict with their beliefs?
I will say, one thing is, I'm just going to be honest, like, you can't win them all. And folks should allocate time and energy into the impact they want to make. So just like, that's not a cop out, but it is kind of a choose your own adventure. Make sure you're putting time, resource, energy into what you want to do and what you think is important. I'll go back to that connection point. We can't make one-on-one connections with literally everyone we talk to, but the more that messaging and story can be personalized to folks, it might not necessarily mean we're going to completely change their mind, but it shows that we are listening to them, even if we might not necessarily agree with them. But that part of like listening first, knowing who you're talking to, trying to make a connection, that needs to happen all the time, but it's especially important when we might be trying to get something across that our audience is not as receptive to. It might not be the magic solve, but without that, we can't even really get in the door to have the conversation.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is that, with the idea of connection, there is a consistency to that as well. And so it's not just showing up once and moving on, but it's being consistent in that message and in being present with that message.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perfect. All righty. It looks like we have time for a couple more questions. So this next one, Jordan, you spoke to this earlier in the presentation, but if you could expand on it a bit more, the question is, what do you say to people who say scientists only care about data, facts, technical information? How do you prove the value of things like story and brand?
It's a great question. And I think, when I was coming up and being trained as a scientist, what helped me was seeing how excited I felt hearing talks that really were, pulling in storytelling, or even if it's talks from, colleagues, and seeing like, oh, I really engaged with that. Like I didn't understand maybe everything, but I was, brought along with the information because the person telling the story or giving the talk, whatever it is, made it clear to me. And it was because there were all these storytelling elements. And so, challenging people to think through, like, who are the, the people who are the scientists you follow and want to hear from and engage with, and are they just slapping data into, a blue sky post, or just slapping data on a slide, or are they giving you context? Are they sharing with you the challenges and how they solve them? And then showing like these are all parts of storytelling. And this isn't something that is instinctive, it's a trained skill, and you can learn it too through various means.
Jane, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you got it.
Well done, Jordan. All right. One more direct question that comes in that also kind of dovetails with that is, do you need a PhD to be a science communicator?
No.
No.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I'll just pop in. It's so Jordan and I do both have PhDs, and neither of us need these letters after our name to do what we do. I will say personally that I do love the fact that I went through grad school and I got a PhD, and I actually still adjunct and I'm still somewhat involved with what I got my PhD in, and it did really teach me a lot about like how to think and how to kind of interrogate questions and all of that. So I would not redo my experience of getting a PhD in a field that I know no longer kind of touch on a daily basis. However, the short answer is no. There is no one path to be a science communicator. And just because Jordan and I share initials after our names, we don't even have similar paths in that way. So I just like this is it's a long-winded answer saying no, but I think that's the kind of like take home there.
Absolutely. I think the people that I saw out in the professional world that got me excited about training in communication as a scientist, very few of them had PhDs. Instead, they were people that were just really good at what they were doing and really good at asking the right questions and presenting what they learned to, well, to me and to others. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we have time for about 1 to 2 more questions, depending on the length of answers. So one question that came in is, how does a communicator / marketer go about translating complex scientific information for a non-scientific audience?
I think I think it goes back to it's understanding who those folks are first.
Mm-hmm.
And it's coming up with there's this idea in SciComm about dumbing things down to your audience, which is kind of like the deficit model. It's outdated and garbage. And it's not necessarily about dumbing things down. It's about finding a shared language to communicate with. And so it's no different than communicating to someone in a foreign language and expecting them to understand you, or communicating with say like your auto mechanic, and you want to be able for them to talk to you about a thing about your car that you understand. So it's about understanding who they are and what kind of shared language you can have between the two of you as a scientist, communicator, marketer, whoever it might be, and them as an audience. And then frankly, doing your best to communicate in that shared way. So I feel like that idea of a shared language, it's one of the most important first things to really get started.
I think too, just building in some amount of testing of your ideas and how you're communicating that idea into your message. As you know, digging into some of the research that's out there, there are people in the space saying like, you've reached your audience effectively when they actually do what you talk about them doing, or they understand, or they're able to react in the way that you maybe anticipated or planned. And so being able to test out your ideas and how you're framing information to members of the target audience. I think too, one thing that is helpful if you're working at an organization where you have access to the scientists doing the work, you can test the ideas with them and see, okay, does this capture accuracy, or how might you describe this to somebody from this background? Like, explain it to your grandmother. That's one I often use if I'm trying to reach, a general audience. But just testing your ideas out amongst different people and seeing, okay, am I meeting both accuracy and intelligibility?
Alrighty. One more question before we close out today. We are very engaged in the chat. This last question is, can you share an example of a campaign you think used storytelling effectively?
Good.
Yeah. One of my favorite campaigns, and it's not a science marketing campaign by any stretch, but it was a campaign out of Birkenstock shoes that is like called Ugly is Beautiful, and it was a 3-part video series. I'm not somebody who owns Birkenstock shoes, but watching the 3-part series, which go from like the history and the ethos behind the design of the shoes, goes into the science of why their shoes are great for feet, apparently. I found myself getting swept into it and really wanting a pair. And so I just found myself being like drawn into, honestly, drawn into the value proposition for the marketing. And I just really enjoyed the quality of it, as well as, the different beats that they hit within their storytelling.
And my example is very short in a short amount of time. I am from the Pittsburgh area. Heinz ketchup is very special to me as a proud Yinzer. And there was a campaign called The Wait. It is a 15 seconds Heinz commercial where it shows a person on a date who has a burger in front of them, literally trying to get the attention of every single waiter that goes by them, waiting for Heinz ketchup before they begin their meal. Stories don't have to be long. They don't even have to have all the twists and turns in the arcs of what Jordan was talking about earlier. 15 seconds just told you everything you wanted to know and everything you needed to know about this person, about the situation, about what this thing meant to them. And it sticks with me for a number of reasons, but that one will always really stick with me.
Humor. All righty. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Jordan and Shane, for educating us.
Thanks for having us. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.